So, all right, we are recording. So I'm going to just turn it over to Pete, who is doing stuff tonight, and he's going to introduce himself, which is excellent because it saves me the trouble. So over to you, Pete.
All right.
Who are you?
What are you doing now?
Yes,
yes, I can see the little red light. Yes. It's just like in the movies. Okay, so my name is Pete Radvan. I started doing reenactment in 1982 when I joined the Ancient and Medieval Martial Arts Society. And that was at the tender age of 28. There wasn't any other game in town. And at the time, I loved it. It was really great because I was able to do something I haven't been able to do for a long time, which was hit people with swords. So, yes, the way we used to play back then was a little primitive, perhaps. What I was hoping to do here was find a way to get a Facebook link so that people can have a look. Is that possible, Tim? We can interrupt this and get people to have a look at some videos?
Yep. All you need to do is get the videos on your computer, and then you just go down to where it says share screen. You just hit share screen, but make sure you hit where it says share computer sound, and we can all watch the videos together.
Okay. All right. So, yes. So I did reenactment for many, many years. I was in the Ancient Medieval Martial Arts Society for quite a long time. Then I went freelance for a bit and ended up joining the New South Wales Pike and Musket Society. So for about 14 years, I did reenactment until somewhere in the early 90s, Steve Hand and I got together to train some blokes in Macquarie University who wanted to do a bit of Dark Age reenactment. So once a week we would trot over there and play with them, show them how to do stuff. And it was around about that time that Steve got hold of a copy of George Silver's Brief Instructions on my Paradoxes of Defence. Studied it for a while, pulled a couple of techniques out of it and started using them. And his ability to use a sword just was astonishing. We went from roughly 50-50 when we sparred to something like 90-10. It was a huge difference just having a couple of techniques from Silver. So it didn't take an awful lot of time to convince me that I needed to change the way I did things. And that was kind of the start of the early days, pre-Stoccata days. In the end, now Andy Brew, who is, I'm not sure if he's here, but he's got his mic off. But Andy Brew and Dave Green and a couple of other guys used to give demonstrations on sword fighting at reenactment events. I went along to a few of those. They were working with secondary sources. They did stuff with Castle, but they were also interested in fighting with swords the way it was done, rather than the make it up as you go along. Now, what we might do here is silence. Short technical difficulty here while I shut this sound up. What I might do here is see if I can get up a link on Facebook of some very, very early reenactment combat. Let's just pull up. Let's toss off Tim and go to Wayne. All right. Now,
don't take that last statement out of context.
All right. Now, how do I do the sharing thing again, Tim?
So green button down the bottom that says share screen. Click that.
Yes.
Yep, that will bring you up a image of all the screens you have.
Aha.
Cool. And Yes, just.
So can we all see that link there?
Well, I can see it.
Yes.
Yep.
Anybody else?
Yep. And if you full screen that, it should full screen for us as well.
Okay, let's full screen it.
Did you turn sound on, Pete?
Is my sound off?
You need to unmute the video.
When you share the screen, there's a checkbox in the bottom left corner that says share computer sound.
I was thinking that you probably don't need to see the sound on this.
That's fine.
You just need to see what chaps are doing.
Sounds good.
So this is very, 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 very early. This is 1973, the first Australian medieval conference, when a group from Tasmania, when some chaps from Tasmania discovered that there were chaps on the mainland doing the same sort of thing, and they got together and they had a meeting. This is just to show how the very earliest reenactment fighting happened. And it's really quite amusing, worth watching, because we have come a long way. Everybody has. So I'm just going to click play at the section. It's been transcribed from film, so as you can see, reenactment started almost instantly an old tradition, which it's never stopped, which is old fat bastards playing. We've got some wonderful battle techniques here. This is where you trade blows carefully, using the shaft of your axe to stop the sword. Equipment was no gauntlets in many cases, no helmets. Same thing again. You play to the weapon rather than to the person you're fighting. Although, to be fair to them, fighting from horseback was a little tricky and had to be choreographed to a certain extent. So we see some wonderful fighting. It's really good stuff, I think. But I only want to show a little bit of that because, of course, it would be unfair. Oh, and then the first thing he does is fall over. So it would be unfair to say that that's how reenactment combat goes. But let's just let's not have any sound. Let's go and here we go. We want to go to this one. Now this one shows some later stuff. This is now, can everyone see this?
Hey.
Yep. Yeah,
we can see it. All right. I'll take off the
Yes.
I'll take off the I'll unmute it. For those who haven't done melee, it's very confusing. You have to have a relatively simple score count. If you get hit, you go down. So people tend to go down very quickly. It's very difficult to do anything else. And you can see a few examples here of how easy it is to be taken unawares. In this one, there might actually be a very brief glimpse of me. As you can see, their spears are used as wedges to knock things open. Let's just pull that one forward. It's basically using lots and lots and lots of spears, and they're all used two-handed. Oh, there's me. Right there, that chap there is me. I must be the only person on the field using a spear and shield, which is the absolute archetypal Dark Age weapon, but apparently, but not very often used. All right, that'll do with that. Okay, so let's. So yes, what can reenactment combat give to HEMAists today? They can give quite a lot. There's a few things they can't give. One of those things being the strike rules. The essence, particularly in Dark Age combat, where there are large amounts of areas where you have to be very careful, means head blows can only go down from above. You can't be stabbing at anyone's face or throat. In many cases, they don't even have shots to forearms in some groups, which is really quite primitive. Nothing as primitive as the days when I was in AMAS, when we only had 4 strikes that we did, 4 blows and 1 thrust, and one of the blows wasn't done because it was hard to see. It was all geared around show fighting, so it was a very, very, very artificial way of fighting. You can see there that there's large numbers of 2-handed spears, which is totally inappropriate to Dark Age combat when everybody had a shield. Because if you didn't have a shield, you'd be taken out by missiles in a very short space of time. Whereas, in fact, there are no missiles on these battlefields, or almost none at all. That's another thing I like to take when I go into reenactment combat. Take missiles. We've got rules for javelins that no one ever uses, which means that people tend to be a bit vulnerable to them, especially my favorite target, which is 2-handed spearmen. But the one thing that you do need to have in reenactment combat is situational awareness. And situational awareness is definitely something that reenactors can bring to HEMAists, because HEMAists, in my experience, because they do almost all their fighting one-on-one, have very low situational awareness. They're watching the person in front of them. Whereas in reenactment combat, you have to be watching absolutely everybody, because someone is going to come in from behind or from the side and hit you unawares, and you can be facing multiple weapons, and multiple spears are quite tricky to face. So yes, we've got, let's just refer to my notes that I made. So similarities and differences. The differences you can see here, where you've got mass of people milling around, and there are basically only 2 kinds of shots in reenactment combat. One is head blows, straight down on top of the head, and the other one is being stabbed with a spear. The other thing that they use spears for, which of course is quite inauthentic, is they use spears as battering rams to smash shields apart, which is something you would never do in a real battle, for the simple reason that if you did, you'd lose your spear immediately, because it would get stuck in a shield, and then someone would hit it with something, and then you wouldn't have a spear anymore. You'd just have a stick, which have shown themselves to be singularly useless when it comes to fighting in battles. Now, here we go. Now, the one that is quite interesting, a little bit more we have here. I want to go to, which one do I want to go to? 2 minutes and 18 seconds. So let's go through. Don't hit too hard. Now, it's a little hard to see because of the poor quality of the resolution, but people hold their weapons over the top of their heads to prevent downward strikes. And they have their long Dane axes with ludicrously long handles held at an angle of about 45 degrees in front of them, and then they drop it down 30 centimeters on your head, and that's you having your head split open with a great axe. Except, of course, this young chap here who's hoeing away furiously. But again, it's all spear thrusts and hits on the head. There aren't any other blows. And everyone is protecting their head with a St. George ward. Very popular, the St. George ward. You hold your sword over the top of your head, and the reason it works so well is that reenactors are very polite and don't actually hit each other very hard. If you tried that in a real battle, someone would just drop something very hard on your head and your sword wouldn't do anything to protect you at all. You even get to the stage of someone in the second rank who's taller than someone in the first rank politely holding their sword over their head of the person in front of them, so they get some extra protection as well. And then everyone shuffles together very carefully and then flails away, and every time you get hit, down you go. So it's great fun, but endless repetition of it becomes boring. And so, yes, I became quite bored with it and was very happy to move on to something that was martially a little more realistic, as realistic as you can. So similarities between reenactment and HEMA, because they all come from the same broad group. You've got, including LARPing. Having seen a bit of LARPing, my niece does LARPing. She and her boyfriend do quite a lot of it. And watching them fight just reminds me so much of reenactors fighting. The only difference that they're using foam swords rather than real ones, and they have a slightly different way of allowing for hits. It became too difficult in reenactment when you've got 50 people or 60 or 100 people aside to say, well, you're wearing mail, so you can take 3 hits before you go down, and you're only wearing cloth, so you have to take 1, and this guy's got lamella on top of his mail, so he can take 5. That's never going to work. So in the end, you just unrealistically go 1 blow and down you go. But otherwise, yeah, very similar in the way it's done. I think in many respects to LARPing, there's a lot of similarities. So the similarities, weapons. One of the things that HEMAists may not appreciate, that the reason that they've got so much choice in weapons is because of the number of reenactors there are in the world, particularly in Europe and America. The SCA is huge when it comes to buying weapons. All the armorers in the USA are basically catering for the SCA. And in Europe, vast swarms of reenactors doing Dark Age and Roman and English Civil War and so on. And without those weapons, it would be a lot harder for us to do what we do. I think we need to appreciate that the people who've gone before us, so to speak, have broken a lot of ground when it comes to getting gear together. A lot of the gear HEMAists wear has got very little to do with reenactment, but that depends on what you're doing. If you're doing 15th, 16th century stuff, you're going to be wearing full plate. So you're going to be wearing exactly the same armor as the people doing 15th, 16th century reenactment. And there, I think the crossover is so close that there's very little difference. Reenactors doing 15th, 16th century stuff, and many of them are using the same texts that HEMAists are doing, and fighting in similar ways. So there's very little difference. Where you do see the big difference is between the earlier groups like the Dark Age, where you clearly see a lot of differences, where the lack of protective gear means they have to fight quite differently. So yes, equipment, some of the armor, and some of the combat techniques. But that's where you see the big differences. In reenactment fighting, you have a very limited repertoire of attacks. That's partly due to the armor, as I've discussed, and also for perceived safety reasons. They're using, I like the fact they use spears with metal heads. I'm used to it. Whereas in HEMA, they tend to use the spears with the rubber heads, which allows you to do things that you can't do with a real head, even if it's a blunt metal one. You've got the armor means that the face is exposed and the throat is exposed in Dark Age reenactment. If you're doing English Civil War, then musketeers are wearing leather armor, and which is actually quite good against it, but their faces are not protected. So With that, the reenactment is done very carefully, I think, because you're either using muskets or pikes. So they have to do things that don't look like the way it would have actually looked, because otherwise it would simply be too dangerous. Unless, of course, it's the Russians. The Russians all just gear up and put all that stuff on and get stuck into each other. Russians are absolutely terrifying to watch when they do their reenactment combat. They just get in there and you think, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to decide when you're dead or not? Well, the Russians have it very, very simple. It's when you can't stand being hit anymore, fall over, and that's the end of you. So Russian reenactment is really, really interesting to watch. But they do hurt each other. They break each other's bones. People do get hurt. So yes, the very limited repertoire of attacks and defenses. I don't know how well you could see that in those videos there, but there's only one defense. You hold your sword up above your head in a St. George ward to stop, so that you can then prevent a blow from splitting open your head, so to speak. Attacks hit them on the head, and if you've got a spear, you stab them in the guts or in the back, and pretty much nothing else happens. It's also, you get whole groups in Dark Age groups, reenactment groups, who don't use single-handed spear. A lot of the chaps doing the Byzantine stuff just use two-handed spear with the little kite shield hooked around their neck, and they don't even know what to do when they come up against someone using a spear and a one-hand spear and a shield. They really don't know what to do, and you can actually take advantage of it in small scale combat, because you can reach further than a swordsman, even if you can't reach as far as the guy with the spear can reach. So yes, limited repertoire of attacks, armor, and that perceived safety thing where groups write their safety rules in bronze, and once it's been engraven in bronze, it can never be changed. Now, Steve Hand and I spent something in the region of 10 years going to reenactment events and trying to introduce them to the concept of extending the way they did things, just using simple stuff from George Silver. We would talk to people. We would go around after the events of the day when people were doing casual sparring in campsites and play with people, and never fail to amaze them with our ability to take down virtually anyone in a very short space of time with astonishing magic techniques. But virtually no one was interested. They didn't want to do that. And after about 10 years, Steve and I both gave up and concentrated on just doing what we like doing, which was historical European martial arts, just working in Stoccata. A few people started doing it, and certainly over the years, a steady trickle of reenactors has come through the Stoccata doors, so to speak, played with us for a bit, and gone their way. That they're always recognizable by the way they fight. The things that they have that are useful for them in historical, when our attempts at historical fighting, they have situational awareness, really, really, really good situational awareness. It's very, very difficult to take an experienced reenactor, experienced combatant from reenactment combat. Very difficult to take them unawares. They really do have eyes all over the place, because that's how they've survived. Their judgment of distance is very, very good. Their timing of their attacks is also very, very good. The thing that makes them stand out is often horrible footwork and awful technique. They'll do attacks in false time, for example. But when it comes to judging how far away an enemy is, they don't need to learn anything at all from that. But what they struggle with is they're having to learn how to use their feet properly and to fight in the way we teach it in Stoccata, George Silver's true times. They really do have trouble with that. The ones who can't master it just leave. They wander off again. And the ones who've decided that they prefer the way we do it, they stay. So, for example, Stoccata over the years got a steady trickle of recruits from the Macquarie Dark Age Society, which Tim, of course, was instrumental in. It was instrumental in running for a bit. Went for quite a number of years. I spent quite a few years before I moved to the mountains, popping in once a week to play with them and try and teach them stuff. They were more interested in chatting and eating lunch than anything else. But so it was a very, very casual club. But the ones who weren't members of Stoccata, some of them would get sick of the fact that they could just never defeat anybody who went to Stoccata. So they'd come along to learn some techniques. And we ended up with quite a number of students, some of whom are still with us. So you do get people coming across, but mostly those two streams, historical European martial arts and reenactment, tend to stay separate. You've got a few diehards who are doing both, one of whom is here tonight, Mr. Brew. I'm not sure if Mr. Brew is still on his microphone. But Andy Brew, who's one of the original founders of Stoccata School of Defence, he and Steve Hand and myself started it, and he runs a group up in on the North Shore, together with.
Going, Steve. I'm coming and going, Peter. So make dinner.
Okay. No, that's all right. I mean, everything I'm saying you've already heard before. So, but he and Chris Morgan have been running a group, and they both do reenactment, and they both get into, particularly Chris certainly does a lot of the combat. So Chris switches from one world to the other one. I would probably have been more likely to keep doing that if I'd been in one of the New Varangian Guard groups, because their combat techniques are actually reasonably effective in reenactment terms, having played with them.
Our school and the Mittelgard NVG chapter is about an 80% overlap of membership.
Right. Yes. Okay. So it's actually quite well, in my certainly in Australia, that's quite unusual. Mostly the two sides shall travel parallel, occasionally slinging mud at each other, but not joining. And I mean, I occasionally go along to reenactment events myself and even do a bit of combat, because it's kind of fun, but it's also very frustrating, which is the reason why I gradually stopped doing it in the first place. It was frustratingly limiting, and it's fun to do it, but when you watch it from outside, some of it can look awfully silly. It really can. Axes being held at 45 degrees and dropping down, 60 centimeters, and that's your head being cleaved off. It's like, yeah, okay. And the refusal to abandon the idea that two-handed spears should be the dominant weapon on the Dark Age battlefield, when in fact the only people who should be using two-handed spears are the Byzantines, because they use it with a shield slung over the shoulder, so they've got some protection from missiles. Yes, so you've got that thing about situational awareness. That's really, really useful, and something HEMAists could learn from it. And like I say, it's really, really hard to sneak up on an experienced reenactor. They really are very hard to catch unawares. So we got very strange. Yes, conventions of attack, highly artificial, in many cases, quite highly artificial rules about how you should attack and how you should hit people. Dane axes, which probably best not to get me started on Dane axes, because Dane axes, as used by medievalists, wouldn't be recognized, I think, by as far as we can tell from the historical record that's available to us, wouldn't be recognized if they were taken back to the appropriate time, because they have enormously long handles, so that the axemen can stay in the second rank and drop their axes over the head of the first rank to hit people in the first rank where they can't see them, which is not how any of the records we have suggest Dane axes were used. And basically, yes, no real attempt to recreate medieval battles as they would have been fought. But yes, there's still a contribution, and the one that I think is most useful is that situational awareness thing, and the fact that when reenactors do come to HEMA classes, they already have a really good judgment of distance, and even if their attacks are done in terrible times, their timing for attacks is very good. Now, I'm not sure how many people we've got here, but if let's just do the stop share because we don't need to be looking at my screen. Let's have some, we've only got a small, I'm not sure, is the video I can see just the people who are here, or do we have here who are not on video?
We have quite a few people here who are not on video. I think we have about 13 participants currently, although it does fluctuate. Is this you leading into questions and discussion?
Well, yes, let's get into questions and discussion. I don't really want to talk for a whole hour. My voice will get tired and everyone will get tired of listening to it. So those who are not in video, let's chuck.
I'll keep an eye. I was going to keep an eye on the chat. So if anyone who's not on video wants to ask a question, just put.
I have a question from someone asking me what a false time is. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So for those who aren't aware of don't have a silver vocabulary, attacks can be made in a true time or a false time. The simplest way to describe them is that if you attack in a true time, your weapon precedes you. Create a threat first. The safety rule I teach all my students is be behind your sword. Now, if you step before you swing your sword, you bring the target of your body into view before the threat of your weapon has established itself, and you're liable to be struck. And being struck in a false time are the two main ways, in my experience, that people get hit in combat. Attacking in a false time and attacking to an open line. Now, is everyone familiar with the term, what I mean by an open line?
Probably
or does anyone need that one defined?
Probably, I find it's best if you can give like a quick definition of any given
just
term,
in case, yes.
Just in case.
So,
I'll say define it, please.
Okay, so if you want to attack someone and you've just got a sword and you don't have a shield, then just thrusting at them is liable to get you thrust or hit in return. What you should first do is attack in a way that puts your sword in the way of their sword. So if you're standing opposite each other with swords, you don't just thrust straight forward. You thrust across your body to pick up their sword so that anything they try to do to you is going to fail because your sword is in the way. And attacking in an open line is just making an attack at someone, hoping that they're not going to hit you in return by the time your attack gets to them. So it's a little bit easier to attack in an open line if you have a shield, because the shield on your arm will then close that side of your body for you. But if you've only got a sword, then you have to be a lot more careful about how you do it. You have to make sure that your sword precedes you and is between you and your opponent's sword, as well as into your opponent. And if you do that and you don't put your body in first, you will have attacked with a closed line and a true time. And that doesn't guarantee your success, but it does have a much higher guarantee of you not being hit. And that is the most important thing, because as some of us know and some of us don't, the term fencing is a contraction of the old term defense. This is the art of defense, teaching people how not to get hit with swords, because not getting hit with a sword is the most important part of any combat. It doesn't matter how well you do. If someone takes off your head, it hasn't done you any good. So yes, reenactors are much more likely to attack in a false time, where they bring themselves forward before their weapon is in a position to threaten people. Unless, of course, they've got a two-handed spear, in which, of course, they're always behind their spear. And so they like, as long as possible, they actually brought in rules in Australia about how long a spear could be. And that was directly due to the actions of the New South Wales Pike and Musket Society joining in combats with the pikes at that stage, they weren't that long, were they, Andy? They were only about 12 feet long.
The old ones are 14 feet.
14 feet, yes, which is longer than anyone else's in reenactment.
Yes.
And so they marched forward in a block and proceeded to destroy everybody. And the people that got destroyed didn't like it very much. So they hastily brought in size envy. They hastily brought in a rule that spears couldn't be longer than 12 foot, which neatly excluded the pikes of the New South Wales Pike and Musket Society.
I think it was even shorter than that, wasn't it? Wasn't it 10 feet? Anyway, it doesn't matter.
No, 12. I'm pretty sure it's 12 feet is the absolute maximum. So if I do, my two-handed spear is exactly 12 feet long.
Speaking of rules lawyers.
Yes. Yes, always go into combat with a copy of the rules with you, so you can wave it around.
Interesting you mention that, actually. There have been experiments being done over in Eastern Europe, probably Russia, by a group, I believe, called Tagmata. They do Byzantine stuff, and they've actually been doing some experiments with using short Byzantine pikes with the slung shield at proper length and armor in their standard reenactment combat, as well as one-on-one. And that's been some interesting stuff that's been only come up in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say.
Okay.
And so that's some interesting thing that's also been doing. And I've been watching their progress with great interest, because of course over here we're doing some Byzantine Kantarian stuff as well. With
did a lot of Kantarian drill probably 20 years ago or more.
Yes, I was very
abandoned it probably partly because of that rule change. We're no longer allowed to use it in public, in combat at least.
Yes.
So actually, it
was too effective, was it?
Not surprised.
Well, what was effective was the Pike and Musket Society, but when the rule changed, that also eliminated the Kantarian.
Right.
Actually, that does raise a very interesting question. We sort of touched on last week, looking at LARP and sort of how HEMA and LARP relate, where the rules have a very, very tangible effect on what you can and can't do. But it's kind of interesting that you raise that there's a similar thing in reenactment combat, or like metal weapons reenactment combat, because I guess like there are different types of reenactment and they tend to have very different rules. So what are some of the other rules that have a really substantive impact on the combat? Like, is it because of the rules that reenactors false time all the time? Or is that
lack of technical training? The thing in reenactment, and it's obviously changing significantly when you've got groups like Macquarie who have actually been doing either training or teaching people how to do this. But what Steve and I noticed when we started using silver as the basis for teaching people how to fight with weapons was that you could get beginners up to scratch at 2 to 3 times the speed that it ever happened in reenactment groups. And the reason for that was that in reenactment groups, it's probably changed a bit now, but what it used to be was that the people in reenactment groups who were good with their weapons didn't know why they were good. So it was very difficult for them to teach anybody. They had no theory behind the way they worked. All they knew is that they had managed to work out things like timing and distance better than anybody else. And therefore they used their weapons better. And people had to just kind of keep playing and keep playing and keep playing until either they learnt something useful or they gave up. And it took much, much longer. So doing the stuff that as we do in at Stoccata, or the way Andy's guys do things, you show people how to do things and you show them why they should do it the way they're doing it. So they know why they're learning, and they learn much faster. So not having a theory behind what they're doing really hampers them. But yes, equipment rules have a a lot to do with it. And a really good example is groups that insist on swords having 3mm thick edges. Now, if you've got 3mm thick edges and you've got, say, a diamond profile blade, you're going to end up with a very, very heavy blade. And that means you have to have a short blade. And this side, the first time I saw the guys from Western Australia with their very, very strict rules about that, nobody had a sword longer than about 60 centimeters. So they're doing single combat with cross-hilt swords, none of which are over 60 centimeters long. In addition, they didn't use the point. They only used the edge. There was no thrusting because thrusting is dangerous. You mustn't do thrusting. So they ended up with a very, very strange combat style, which didn't meld very well with the way anyone else did things. First of all, because their swords were so bloody short, they couldn't reach anybody. And when you talk to people about their rules and about how their rules limit them, because their rules have been taught to them from a bronze tablet, so to speak, like Holy Writ, they can't be changed. The people who'd like to change them are the young members because they're frustrated by the fact that they can't do that. But the older members who've been doing it this way for years and years and years, when you say, well, perhaps you could change this or that or the other, you can see their wheels in their head going, but that would put me at a disadvantage to all the people that I can now beat in my group. And they don't want to do it, and they're the ones with the influence, so it doesn't happen. I don't know how. Yeah, you were going to say?
No, continue. I'll just wait until you're done.
No, that's all right. I'm quite happy to stop and let someone else speak, because I'd like to have Andy's input here, because he's in a group where people are actually doing both. And how do you find that works with other NVG groups and with non-NVG groups?
With other NVG groups, it's I was going to say it's fairly fine, but there are exceptions. Let's not name names.
We could probably have a compass direction there.
You know what I'm talking about.
Probably best not to name names. And it's something that's going to be publicly
we know what we're talking about,
yes.
but the rest of you don't need to. That's fine. Whenever you do this stuff, there are always rules and conventions, both of which are based on assumptions. Sometimes they're based on experience, but mostly they're based on assumptions. What Peter said about the West Australians, I think was a very, very true of, say, Amas, but the peace was in the 80s, and for the same reasons.
Yes.
And they had a weird fighting style, which Peter's talked about a bit, and I could add to that, but it doesn't really matter. But it was an artifact of their safety assumptions more than their evidence. Now, this can't be done, that can't be done, we've got to do this, got to have fat edges, can't hit heads, the list goes on. And that creates, and so within those constraints, you have a fight. But you want to hit the bloke, so you do things that will get you to hit the bloke while staying within these artificial rules. And the same is totally true of what you guys are doing in HEMA.
Yes. Yes, we have assumptions and rules. You have to have rules, otherwise there'll be bodies.
Exactly. You have a slightly different set of assumptions, slightly different, and a different set of conventions and a different set of rules based on those. But all of that creates an artifact which determines how you fight, unless you're constantly dragging yourself back to the text.
Yes.
And I see that. I see it with reactors and also see it with HEMA practitioners. And one clue to it, but you don't get this clue in reenactment because you don't have a formal theory. You might have implicit theory, but you don't have formal theory. In HEMA, you've got formal theory and you've got practice. Are they the same? Do people fight what they teach?
What you hope you're doing is drawing the two closer and closer together. That's what you hope you're doing.
Of course.
Whether you are or not.
Yeah, watch people play and watch them teach, and within 5 minutes, if you see them give a lesson, they can have a fight and you see the same thing. Also, I don't see it much.
No.
Because of this artifact of conventions of assaults, if you like.
Look, I have changed the way I teach things over the years, having decided that, yes, we teach this, but guess what? I never use it. And if I never use it, then perhaps there's no point in teaching it. Because either I'm teaching something that's wrong, or I'm teaching something that under the constraints of what we do is right, but cannot be done.
Or it's not good enough yet.
Well, that's the other thing. I've seen people using techniques that I go, well, look, I'm going to show you this technique. I never use it, but I've seen other people use it, and they use it okay. So I'm going to show you, and if it works for you, because there's lots of things that don't work for me. And of course, the older I get, the more things don't work for me. So my fencing style gets simpler and simpler and simpler, just due to the other constraint that happens over time, which is your own body. Because there's just, I can't leap around the way I used to do when I was in my 30s, or at least not for very long.
Well, actually, there's a beautiful quote from Stephen Gapps, who wrote an article on reenactment, like an academic article, because Stephen Gapps is both a reenactor and an academic, where he says there's always the elephant in the room of with reenactors, where our bodies are physically not the same as historical people. Which kind of makes it a bit interesting. But I guess something that just kind of I've always wondered, and it's been bothering me for a very long time. I've never been able to ask you about this, Pete. If there was so little like combat experience, like combat skill experience in reenactment going in, why isn't it that someone with, say, a sports fit, or like any kind of combat sport background, just came in and just basically came up with something functional? Like, why isn't it that you just got like a boxer or a fencer, or like someone who did like full contact karate just come in and go, okay, well, this is how we do things in my system. I'm just going to grab a weapon, see what movements translate, and just beat the hell out of everyone. Because that has happened in a lot of other areas. I mean, there are a lot of knife and stick fighting systems where someone with a different combat sports background has just grabbed a simulator, seen what works, and come up with very effective knife and stick systems. Is there a reason why that didn't happen in reenactment, really before sort of the introduction to HEMA?
Reenactors are, in some respects, a strange group of people. I mean, Steve and I did just that when we first started doing silver, showing people how effective it was in single combat, and having people clustering around and go, oh, how did you do that? Show me that, how you did that. Do that again. And did it stick? No. One thing stuck, the St. George Ward. The St. George Ward was a kind of bleed through from HEMA.
So it's your fault.
It was their version of the George Silver's True Gardant. They basically dropped their hand and flattened their sword and end up in a St. George Ward. We didn't teach them St. George. We were doing George Silver's True Gardant. But people prefer to drop their hand down because True Gardant is tiring if you don't do it for a lot. And also if you've got, like that. Whereas if you go to St. George Ward and you get tired, you can rest your sword on your helmet and give your hand a bit of a rest. So that was pretty much it. There's an innate conservatism in reenactment groups, which comes from mostly, with the exception of the NVG, being little individual groups. Each group is a family unto itself. Probably the best example is Grey Company in WA, who, through no fault of their own, were geographically isolated from everyone else for a long period of time. Being the only game in town, they ended up as a very big group, but with no outside influence. They ended up developing entirely their own rules, which were quite different to other people's. And so when these groups get together and they've all got their own different sets of rules, and this group doesn't do lower leg hits, and this group doesn't even do forearm hits, and And let me tell you, if you've never fought against someone who doesn't do forearm hits, it's an interesting experience because they use their forearm as an extra shield because you're not allowed to hit it. And then you can't hit their head because their arm's over their head.
Having said that, Pete, you can hit it, they just don't have to take it.
That's right. Yes. Bang. And they go,
carry on.
oh, sorry. Yes.
You learn after a while.
You end up being
Andy. God, do not tempt me.
No, you end up being forced to do that sort of thing. Yes, this is really frustrating. And hit them on the arm until they move it. So all these little families get together, and the host group then has to nut out a set of rules which will enable as many people to participate as possible, which always comes down to the lowest common denominator. Which means that the group combats are fun because fighting with 150 other people is fun, but yeah, there's
technically unsatisfying.
It can be very unsatisfying, which is where I think the NVG is in a better position because it's an associated family of groups where everyone is familiar with each other. There are more people you can do stuff with, and as I said earlier, if I'd been a member of the NVG, I would probably still be doing reenactment more vigorously than I do now. Because it is very, very frustrating, particularly when you're doing something which is martially more effective. Is it the way they did it? No, it isn't, because we're not killing each other, as Andy said. But we do. But even within HEMA, you've got really, you've got the sport fencers. They're not interested in trying to fence the way they did at the time. They've turned it into a sport, and then they're trying to work within the confines of a rule set of a sport. And I used to be more against it until I read Maya. Now, in Maya, they'd already, within 200 years of less than 100 years of no longer using long swords in actual military combat, they'd already sportified it. They already had no thrusts because otherwise people get hit because they didn't have effective armor to protect the face and the throat. They had things like flat hits. You could hit with the flat of the blade. You could get the flat of your blade to bend around and hit someone on the side of the head, and that was considered a take. So I thought to myself, well, if they're sportifying longsword 400 years ago, 300 years ago, then I guess we can sportify it now.
Yeah.
Particularly as we're never ever going to use longswords in anger.
That's actually kind of been one of my arguments with HEMA since. If we're talking about all the things we find frustrating about reenactment combat, let's also get frustrated about HEMA.
Yes.
The dominant form of, the dominant application of sword fighting through history, going back as far as we have records, is as leisure and as sport. People who got in life or death fights only got in life or death fights a couple of times in their life. People who were serious about it got, did tournaments, got together with friends and mucked around with swords. They did that on a much, much more common basis. I mean, you look at the life of, say, William Marshall. He competed in I don't know how many tournaments over the course of his life, but he was only in a very small number of battles. Although it should also be noted that he was very, very effective in the battles he was in. But yeah, I think the idea that all sport has been a part of martial arts for as long as we have records. And that's kind of, I think, a very, very important thing to recognize.
Yes. Yeah.
But also that sportified application of it was always regarded as training for the real thing. It wasn't an alternative set of skills.
Yes, but
the moment you start treating it as an alternative set of skills, you lose sight of the martial application of it.
Yeah, but the whole division between sport and martial art that we think of now was actually, near as I can tell, was actually like a marketing gimmick invented sometime in the 50s So you have these martial arts that can't win full contact competitions, but can go, but no, we're for the street, and that's why. And that's, a thing a lot of modern self-defense practitioners are now saying is, well, the best thing to do is just do a lot of combat sports and then apply the different things you learn. So the division between sport and martial art even now is a lot less than I think we think.
But you can just go back to what Andy was saying about look at what they teach and then see how they fight. And that would apply 1,000% to virtually every single so-called self-defense sport that's been taught. That anybody who actually does street fighting, a gang member from Harlem, can pretty much demolish anyone with those skills. Karate, for example, is said to be pretty useless in a fight, except of course if no one else knows how to fight. And you could say that about my fencing skills. How would I survive if I found myself amongst people who are used to actually fighting and killing each other? I might not do so well. But if the zombie apocalypse happened and people started wandering around with swords, virtually everybody I met wouldn't be very good with a sword. And my skills would probably be very, very useful.
Good question.
Yes.
You said before, and I'm a total newbie at all this. So, you know, if I'm on the wrong track, please tell me. You said before that the reenactment groups tend to attack with a false time.
It's quite common, yes.
If that's a result of not training, does that mean that's a more natural?
Look, the simplest, to a certain extent it is.
Correct?
Because if you want to cut down a tree with an axe, the last thing that's going to be very useful for you is attacking the axe in a true time. It doesn't matter how you're going to do much better if you move the body and the axe together, so that if the tree had a weapon, you'd be in trouble, but it doesn't. And when we attack each other in a natural way, yes, our timing and whatnot is often horrible, which is why you do training. Probably the best example I ever saw of that was a riot in one of the golden Sikh temples quite a number of years ago now, which got recorded on video. Now, the Sikhs have a martial, quite a martial background, and they do a lot of training. A lot of Sikh men train with the talwars, the sabers that they use. So they're quite martial chaps. And these guys got angry with each other. Everyone was wearing their ceremonial talwars, and they got stuck into each other. And a lot of these fights got recorded. There was whatever they had learned went straight out of the window when anger and adrenaline poured through their body, and they flailed away at each other horribly. The interesting thing was that nobody got hurt. They didn't hurt each other. But there was no judgment of time. There was no judgment of distance. There was no skill. They just raised their arms and brought the swords up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, the way anybody would who got angry and picked up a stick, and, you know, the way a 10-year-old kid would be flailing away at his brother with a cricket bat or a cricket stump. So yes, when adrenaline pumps into your body, all your training can quite readily go out of the window. So that's why you need to train. And things like false time attacks matter less in a battle. If you've got a battle where you've got everyone lined up and everyone's got a shield and everyone's got an axe or a sword or a spear, you can't pick and judge your distance from your enemy. They charge up and you start hitting each other. And the best way to survive is to smash your weapon up and down as hard as possible, so that people in front of you aren't doing anything to you in return. And for battles, I think only a small number of skills are required. The first one of which is the best time to unleash your weapon. Stand there waiting for your enemy to approach, and then at the appropriate time, when they're just at the right distance, smash them with your weapon, and down they go. You can't step forwards, you can't step back. If you step forwards, you leave the line, and you'll get, the very least, you'll get in trouble with your compatriots. At the very most, you'll get instantly killed because you'll be too close to your enemies and no one can help you. And the other beauty about that, of course, is in those sort of battle situations, the people you have hit don't get to go away, ponder over what happened, and improve the way they do things, because with a bit of luck, they're dead.
Well, so I've raised this with Tim before. There's a series on YouTube called machete fight to the Dominican Republic, would actually go at it with machetes in their little.
Yeah, they settle their differences with machetes. Yes.
Yeah, and it's probably the closest you'll come in the modern age to sword combat that you can see in life.
Fighting with deadly intent.
Yeah, and once they'll pick up anything to work as a shield in the offhand. But the introduction of any weapon, and you can see this in a lot of news clippings of knife fights and knife attacks. The introduction of a real weapon in each hand, by each participant.
Yes.
Certainly changes from that safety aspect with rules where we won't do certain things.
Yep.
It becomes much more cautious and much more.
People don't hurl themselves at each other.
Yeah, because there's no safety net anymore.
No.
If I come in range, I will get hurt. I will die. There will be blood.
I do tell my students on a regular basis that how you would feel how would you feel if your opponent had a sharp weapon in their hand as you did, and if you messed up, you could be dead.
A prime example of that is from that young fella attacked the old bloke down in I think it was down in southwest Sydney way a couple of years ago.
Yes.
He ran into a local hairdressing salon, and the bloke with the knife, as soon as the neighbours had, I think it was a paling or a piece of wood, his whole demeanour of attack went back to defence, because now it's suddenly become equal.
Now he could get hurt.
Weapon, you've got a weapon. Now I can get hurt, whereas before it was 100 to 0.
Right.
50. And I think from what you're saying, the natural reaction, if I'm understanding what you said before, this natural reaction pre-training is the open line and the false time, which is what you see in these attacks from untrained people constantly in the street.
If you don't know what to do, you'll simply attack. It will take time and survival and pondering and more experienced people to teach you how to attack better, which in fact, with knife fighting, if you were lucky, you would have a relative who could show you how to do it, that relative having survived actual knife fights. But if you cast your mind back to the reenactment combats I showed there, where groups of people with weapons came together, I think the way they did it is the way that most people would have done. You run up as fierce as possible, and then when you get quite close, you slow down because you don't want to run onto their weapons. And then you start moving forward. It's the soldiers, the professional soldiers, who just go, fuck it. I think it's one of the reasons why martial societies developed this thing about just throw yourself into it. Because if you hurl yourself forward furiously at your enemy, risking your life, there's a very good chance that when your enemy has some madman screaming furiously descending on them, they're going to back away.
Isn't that the same with every military training and special forces training? Is aggression development.
Overcoming your fear of being killed.
Yeah, it's an aggression development.
Yes. You have to develop aggression with skill behind it, because just running forward screaming isn't going to be very useful. Professional soldiers will march forward together and keep the discipline of their formation, whilst not allowing the fear of death to interfere with what they have to do. The stuff that's been written on ancient Greek combat, hoplite combat, some very interesting research has been done there, which sheds a light on what it would have been like living in a society where every adult male from 18 to 60 could be liable for military service to protect his city-state, and could expect to fight many times in the course of his life. You could expect out of every 3 years, there might be 1 or 2 years in which there would be battles. They used to fight each other all the time. And the casualty statistics in those hoplite battles were between 5 to 10% casualties for the winners and between 10 to 25% casualty for the losers. And everybody knew what your chances were of living and dying. So everybody knew what it was like to be terrified before battle. Everybody knew what it was like, if someone shit themselves, no one remarked on it because everybody had shit themselves. And when you went into battle, knowing what your odds, that the best odds you could face was 5%, was a 95% chance of survival if you win. That's a sobering thought. And you're going to do this, and then next year's going to be a break, and the year after a break, and the year after that, you're going to do it again. And it's going to keep happening until you're 60 and too old to play.
So do you think that also that adrenaline rush then is, when I've read this in other papers on combat, is the removal from the adrenaline rush of fine motor skills and going back to gross motor skills?
Terrible.
That's why combat's based on gross motor skills.
Yes. I'm a big fan of keep it simple, stupid, and I don't like teaching my students complicated stuff, because no one can use the complicated stuff. Works beautifully in the SAL, where two people who know what they're doing, who have a prior agreement basically on how they're going to do it, and have not got the adrenaline pumping. But if they go out in a duel and they're actually fighting with sharps to kill each other, stuff goes out the bloody window.
Exactly what Tim and I were talking about the other day, Tim, when you talked about when you bring in actual speed, combat speed into techniques, the concept of all that bind and...
Oh, that was a different thing.
Yeah, they don't.
So, I'll actually, I think Petal like this, why silver, like, so something I was trying to work out a little while ago, why is there no concept of true times? Like, why is there no true times theory in 19th century in post-Enlightenment sword fighting? Because it's a really useful theory in terms of explaining what to do, but it disappears. There's a point where it disappears, and the point where it disappears is the point where single sticking becomes a dominant spectator sport, where you can go into town and see two people whacking each other with sticks until one of them is bleeding from the head. And the more I've been reading about the sticks that they were using, it sounds that they were quite thin, and they were also very flexible, because people used to complain all the time that judges had miscalled about because the stick had bent around a parry. But my suspicion is why Silver was so big on true times is he saw a lot of people who were training at slow speed, because back in Silver's day, in the Elizabethan period, they didn't have fencing masks, so they had to go slow to be safe, were able to respond to a very short, very fast action done with a very, very big, very slow action. And they'd be like, this totally works. This is fine. And Silver's like, no, when you actually have speed involved, certain actions are faster. And I've seen the same thing with both doing slow speed bouting myself and also seeing other people do it, where there's a lot of times where you do respond to what would be a very fast action at speed with what would be a much slower action, except that everyone's slowed down and the time frame gets weird. So yeah, that was a slightly different. I think that was.
I wonder if the thing with single sticks was that people stood in distance and flailed away at each other.
Interesting with cudgel play, yes. The more I look into it, the more I think that cudgel play model where people are standing in distance, getting cracked on the elbow to protect their face, is the exception. And you see that in very few manuals actually describe it. But interestingly enough, Alfred Hutton, when he wrote a history of single stick for one of the encyclopedias have been putting together for a slow burning research project, he actually thinks that a big part of the point of cudgel play was to get people used to just standing and getting whacked in the face and being injured. And he compares it to the German Metzger, which is basically the same thing, except with liberal nationalist overtones. But yeah, I guess going back to that whole thing of people flinching and being afraid to get hit, there's a lot of different martial traditions which emphasize doing things that cause impact. So you have single stick cudgel play where you get hit in the face with with a stick and it hurts, and you keep doing it until you bleed. There's stick fighting traditions. Certainly the Zulus had the stick fighting tradition that's still practiced today, where they get, if they're being nice, a thin, flexible branch, and if they're not, a thicker branch with a knobbled weight at the end, and just basically whack at each other. And the effect is the same. It gets you used to pain, it gets you used to impact, and it gets you used to flinching less and backing down less. And actually, I think there's actually, it's not a technical manual, but it's a manual on how to train knights in terms of what training to do, and like how to basically raise a young nobleman to be a knight, where the author actually says that it's important for a young man to feel his teeth crack from impact, to do jousting and to do tournaments, and basically just to get repeatedly hit.
To get hurt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's not necessarily getting hurt, it's getting hit, getting rattled to the point where he's okay with it.
One other area where I know a few other things. One, on the aggression, there is a lovely quote that I remember from, I believe, Austrian, maybe German, maybe French. Hussar teaching a new one, and after he's taught him the strikes, the younger person goes, "But what about the parries?" And he just responds, "You don't need to parry, just keep hitting him and make him parry," is one of the ones, and you just keep on the attack, and eventually he's going to make mistakes. Another example of a sword system that's kind of extended to the modern day is in the Caucasus, Armenia, and Georgia, where they have this quasi sword and buckler system, which has almost been turned into a national dance, but they were still kind of using it up until the early 20th century. And we have photos from the early 1910s of them in those miziurkas and those bucklers and short swords, various, sorts of Caucasian swords and full coats of mail in the early 20th century. And they're still doing this song and dance, some ways figuratively and some ways literally, right up until then. And that's another area where they're very much still they are going at it with a very heavy intensity.
Wind back a moment. Sorry, we'll finish.
The last one being regarding going actually back to reenactment. One of the most interesting things that I experienced recently was getting a chance to do ancient style sword and shield, centered around Roman style sword and shield. And the one interesting idea being that headshots went out the window. And so all of a sudden you had to be a lot more creative. You can't just do this. You've got to go back and forth, because Roman sources made the assumption that your helmet is going to protect you. So there's no point putting the sword up here. So it actually just goes up here or down here. And so the techniques are very different. And Richard was telling me about, and Richard Robinson was the one who, Richard Robinson and Matt Bryant were the two that was hosting it over the October long weekend. And that was very interesting for me, at the very least, trying this entirely new system where it makes a presumption that a degree of armor actually matters, despite the fact, and so you can't just do that same thing where you're going dung, 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 dung. It doesn't work, because the weapons are relatively light and the armor is actually substantial enough to do something. And he does mention that there are a time, one point or another, where they were going to switch away from the combat, switched away to non-headshot blows. And I believe this was an old Armadale or something. And apparently 50% of the people just walked off the field. Were a few anecdotes I remember hearing from him regarding that. And so I found that to be interesting as well.
Well, it's breaking the accepted rule set. You can't change the rule set like that. Otherwise, I'm not going to want to play. I mean, that assumption of the effectiveness of the Roman helmet is not unreasonable in the face of one-handed weapons. It was a good helmet, but also they learnt to tuck their head down behind their shield. They didn't leave it stuck up there. They kind of raised the shield slightly and then sort of got the head down there so that their head was more or less protected. It's basically a fighting style behind a very large shield.
Yeah.
And your vulnerabilities are going to be your extremities.
When you have a big shield, you don't guard your head with your sword in any case. It's lunacy. Your sword's hitting the other bloke.
Yes. What's the point of having a really big shield? Also, you're just having it up there with that curved shield would just be crazy. Its job is it has one job only, and that's to put the pointy end into the other chap.
Perhaps, but in a Bjorgvik, some of the South Australian Romans, Terry's crew, did try to use their Roman style techniques in Dark Age reenactment combat. What that happened was immediately they were advancing normally with the shields in the appropriate grip and trying to duck, and they were just getting dunked repeatedly. And then it went from their swords being in the normal attack position to, say, George guards to let them actually close.
They were using their shields wrong. Whether it's reenactors or as Romans, they were using their shields wrong, if that's what was happening.
Suppose.
Can I just wind back a moment to the question Mick raised a little while ago about natural fight versus trained fight? I think that was interesting. And Pete's answer, I think, ended up being somewhat orthogonal. We're talking about two separate axes here that interact. There's the natural fight versus the trained fight, and there's the single combat fight versus the military fight. They're not the same. Natural fight is natural, obviously, but as you observed, it tends to be crap. There's what's called the art of defence, because we need art to overcome nature, because art's better. A trained fighter who can maintain his cool will beat an untrained fighter delivering a haymaker, whether it's with a fist or with a sword. But the skills that are involved in doing that, as Pete started out by saying an hour and a half ago, are very different from the skills involved in holding a shield wall, pressing it against the enemy. Now, Tim's observations about training to take pain and so on, I think is attributed to both, because there are certain personal qualities, moral qualities that are required of both. Courage, determination, pain tolerance. Whether you're going to fight a duel or fight in a battle, you need those things. So the various trainings that Tim was talking about, I think, are moral training rather than technical training. So if you don't have that, you're not going to fight anything. You'll run away, which might be entirely appropriate. But if you have those qualities of stickability, then if you're fighting one bloke in the cell or in a duel or in a street, that's one set of skills required. If you're lining up your mates with a shield and a spear, that's another set of skills required. Situational awareness is part of it, but discipline and there's a whole bunch of other things. There's some overlap, but not very much between martial skills, military skills, and single combat skills.
Socrates.
My only point was just raising. Sorry, Pete.
No, go.
Was just that clearly, and I'm only going off what Pete said about the reenactment groups compared to the HEMA groups, that the untrained person used an open line with a false time.
Exactly so.
Was liable to, yes.
Yeah, generally. And then once training commenced, which was more superior or made them better combatant.
Hopefully.
Was a closed line with a true time.
Yep.
So
yes.
Clearly the natural movement is to be a open line with a false time. It's just a natural, the average punter will grab something and do that.
That's right. Yes. And if you haven't been taken by surprise, which is one of the problems of the combat, because if you're taken by surprise, your art will fly out the window. But if you're not taken by surprise, if you have enough time to gather yourself and to be ready for it, then you will, if you're armed with something, with another fence post, you'll be able to take advantage of him. But Socrates made an interesting point, because Socrates, as a Greek, took part in combat. And he said that in the battle line, very little to no martial skill is required. The only skill that's required is stay in the battle line, you carry your shield for your friends, as not for yourself, and just stab out with you can have your eyes shut as you stab with your spear. It won't make any difference. But he said, once the battle has been won and it's broken up into individual chases, that's when the chap who spent some time at the gymnasium is more likely to come home. Because when it breaks down to individual and small group combats, then you're more likely to survive. That's when you need your martial skills. And Socrates himself, in one of the battles, and I can't remember which one it was, when the Athenians were defeated, he held together a group of about 50 men, and they marched off the field in formation, and none of the enemy bothered to go near them. They saw no reason why they should engage in a dangerous fight with someone who was not disordered, when there were lots of frightened people running in all directions that they could chase down and stab in the back.
And that goes back to the concept, pardon me, of a battle not wanting to be hurt.
Yes.
Most people don't want to be hurt.
We've won the battle. Why should I then engage in another mini battle and risk my life against chaps who aren't running away when I can chase chaps who are running away?
But the situational awareness of that is also what Mosh was talking about last week. In all the training, situational awareness was the same terms. It's the same terms I've had special training with other groups, and it's the same situation. Situational awareness.
Yes.
Keeps you alive.
Yes, spotting trouble before it comes, before it happens, recognizing a situation, and then placing yourself in a position to either defend or most sensibly exit. Whereas, as opposed to blundering blindly into something, and that comes from long experience. And I've known people with fantastic. I had a girlfriend who had fantastic situational awareness, and that was because of her breasts. Her breasts she was a small girl, and her breasts sprang up literally overnight when she was 12, and they were very, very large. She was a 42 double D, and she was 4 foot 10 inches. And she got followed everywhere. She had men would just grab her tits in the street. She could smell trouble a mile away. She wasn't afraid to walk anywhere at midnight because she could tell when trouble was coming and simply avoid it.
Well, it's actually a thing with a lot of vulnerable groups and people who, walking down the streets can be dangerous. You talk to them about like dealing with situations, and they often have no idea how to fight, but what they have is situational awareness and de-escalation.
How to run away.
Yeah, or just how to spot trouble and avoid it.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and then how to stop it from escalating to violence when it does.
Yes, and that's a really, really, really useful skill.
Yeah.
Because the thing about fighting is it's always dangerous, especially when weapons are involved. As soon as weapons become involved, somebody is liable to be very, very badly injured. And if you don't want to be injured, try and avoid it. Which comes back to the thing that Andy was talking about the courage you need for battle, where you have to not think about being injured. Because if you're thinking about being injured, then you're not going to be much use in the battle.
It is considered that there are two skills, and I've noticed that this translates to when I did some LARP, to when I did reenactment, and even playing the first-person hack-and-slash game Mordhau. Two sorts of skills. One is the skill to physically fight, move the sword, have timing, and the other skill is what I coined the term from Lindy Beige. It's known as skirmish skill, the ability to have a general sense of how people are moving, where people are moving, and the ability to go and the ability to realize that someone's about to make a break for it and be able to halt that. A good example that I had in the Mordhau situation was it was 2 fights on a stair, and I saw a pile of rocks. And so I abandoned the formation, went round, grabbed some rocks, and wiped out half of the enemy team by just going, wait a second, I know what's about to happen here. And I'm terrible at actually fighting people, but I often find that one thing that I can often predict is just like when that moment is going to be, when there's going to be a charge, when someone's going to make a flank, when a line's about to collapse or anything like that. And those are two very separate skills. In reenactment or LARP combat, anything that involves any sort of numbers whatsoever, it's that general sense of just where to be effective in any sort of skirmish or battle.
That's why there were some people who spent their whole lives as a soldier and lived to retire. They didn't do it by sticking their neck out when it shouldn't have been stuck out.
And they also got very wealthy in the process. Actually, it does bring up a question I've been meaning to ask for a little while. When you talked about the difference between individual combat and formation fighting, what could reenactment combat teach us about formations? Mass combat, because I guess just to inject one of my stories,
an awful lot. How to hold a line, even when that line is. I mean, it's easy to hold a line when you're all shoulder to shoulder. But I've been in fights in the past where, as people are trying to flank a small group, you have to stretch your line up, and the gaps between the individual members get larger and larger. If you can maintain an awareness of where everybody is, just constantly flicking your eyes backwards and forwards, even when there's 6 foot space between you, you're still a line. You lose that situational awareness and you're no longer a line. And that just basically takes lots and lots of practice. Running together, fighting, one side winning, everyone gets up and they do it again.
Okay. And with that, have you actually, like that, maintaining a line, Have you tried to use historically documented drill manuals or recreate things, or is it all sort of just make it up as you go along? Just see
No,
what
practice.
works?
Just practice. Andy, you were going to say something.
Yeah.
Historical drill manuals will tell you how to handle formations of hundreds of men. They won't tell you how to do it when you've got a dozen men or half a dozen, or you break them into small groups. So those drill manuals are great if you want to do Byzantine Quintarian blocks or 17th century Pike blocks. Awesome. The instructions are there. Follow those. If you want to learn this situational awareness or skirmish awareness, as Will Lindybates put it, given that I said earlier, there are two separate skill sets: individual fighting, group fighting. If you think it's worth your while to build up from one to the other, the way I suggest you do it is this. You already know how to fight one-on-one. Then go to as many people as you have in the room. So we're going to have a fight with all of us, every man for himself.
Yep.
Do that.
Yeah.
Then you form pairs. It's every pair for themselves. Then groups of 3, then groups of 4, whatever, until you're up to half the group against the other half of the group. Now, I won't say that you need to this many reps of each iteration. Mix them up. Start with one man fighting against one against one's against everyone, two's against everyone. As work up and just repeat that, and you'll get good at it eventually.
Freaking brilliant training idea. Thank you.
That's my rec training. There's
So Tim, that's the one thing every week I say, get one thing. That's it. That's done it. Thank you.
There's a variant on that.
I'm walking away with that.
A game we play at the NVG sometimes, which is 2 in, where you have a defined area. A team of 2 starts in the area, and it's timed 0. One man goes in to face them. 10 seconds later, he gets a mate.
Assuming he's still alive.
Exactly. 10 seconds after that, he gets a mate, and so on. So the 2 guys have to kill the intruder really quickly, and the intruders, of course, have to just avoid and survive until they get a mate.
Can't survive. Yes.
So that gives you tactics of distance and manoeuvre, and tactical awareness of when the mate's coming and where he's coming, and how you want them facing when he comes, and it builds up. So the 2 win quickly or not at all.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very hard school of learning. That's a very hard school.
That's a good game with half a dozen people.
Yeah, I like that. That's a nice idea.
There's another game that we've actually developed over in our club, the Anheria, which is basically real life, which we've kind of dubbed real life Naffle Taffle, where it's essentially there is the king and maybe like 2 guards, and they have to get to the corners, and there is 1, 2, 3, 4 people on the flats around the edges that have to intercept them. And when you're in the middle, and when you're in the middle, either as a bodyguard or as a king, it is really easy to just focus on the forward and just get absolutely blindsided. It is amazingly doable, and it's very interesting to be in the various positions where you're guarding, you're attacking, trying to hold them away, or other such games. And they do play to very different skills, trying to also there's other minor things like, don't run, otherwise it gets very silly and a little too chaotic too quickly, to some degree. But I find, and 2 versus the world, we do that as well. That's excellent for just not for both survivability and just learning to end a fight fast and not be a little too cautious, which I know is
that's the concept of tunnel vision, isn't it? One-on-one, you get focused, or whatever you're doing, you get focused on the end result to the exclusion. And a lot of people involved in big events say they only see one thing. And you've got a situation awareness is the expansion of that to whatever is around you.
As what you see that's how you pick out beginners, newbies in reenactment combat. 2 people off on the edge fighting each other. It's like, oh, excellent. These guys know what they're doing. And you run up behind the one who's not on your side and you stab them in the back. So yes, tunnel vision is concentrating on one person is one of the deadliest things you can do in group combat. You must not. And I think it was in 5 Gold Rings, Masashi who said that if you're fighting a numerous people, you simply go from one to the other. Strike one, strike at one, strike another one, strike another one, strike. Never, ever, ever get into a fight with one of them.
I just want to interject. It took me about 2 years of like flat fighting of anywhere between 300 and 600 every Friday night. It took about 2 years before I could kind of dedicate some thought to a different like shield wall or to a different front while fighting the one that I'm worried about.
It's hard, isn't it?
Weekly, 2 years, and then I think I can think about what's happening on the other side of the field.
Yep.
And then another 3 years before I could. No, I can watch that while fighting the 5 people in front of me. This is fine.
As mentioned earlier, when you're with lots of people, or even in a nice formal line with 10 of you here and 10 of you there, it's never the bloke in front of you that kills you.
No, it's the bloke you're not watching.
If the bloke 2 places down, you reach it up and smack.
One of my first fights in reenactment against when I was still with the MBG, I was 4v4 and I just thought I'd sidle right and right. Then all of a sudden, Guaf just turns, pivots, stab. And I was just like, what? And I found that as well. That
how did he know that?
How did he read that? And I figure, oh, it's about this long. I'm this far away. I'm fine. No. I've also gotten into Spear as well. And I find that particularly if there's a lot of shields on the other side, you have to, because I avoid the whole battering ramming thing for the sake of courtesy, it very much is poke, poke, poke. Oh, he's starting to stab someone. Funk. It's instantly that, it's very much that sense of like, right, keep him occupied, keep him occupied, keep him occupied. You've made a mistake. Bye. That is one.
Yes, appearing to fight one person. That seeming to fight one person, but only keeping one eye on them. You're not fighting them. There's a guy over on the right who appears to be getting a little bit too far forward, and you're waiting for him to take half a step forward, and then suddenly your weapon's in him and not the chap you're fighting. Yes. And as Mosh said, it takes by golly gee, it takes a long time to develop those skills, and it involves being stabbed and hit and knocked over and lying down on the ground under your shield many times. But I really like that 2-in thing. That's because I do a little bit of group stuff with my students. It's mostly one-on-one, but I like to do a little bit of group stuff with them. And making them think about, using your peripheral vision, noticing stuff. And we don't do it a lot, so they're not very good at it. But that's okay.
And to return to my earlier point, even with 2 or 3 people, as I said, it's never the bloke in front of you that kills you. And whoever kills who, careful manipulation of blades has almost nothing to do with it.
Yes.
It's all about situational awareness.
Yep.
Picking the moment, picking the angle, and going smack, done.
Yes.
Next.
Yep. Really simple techniques. Yep. All you really need to know is how to knock someone's weapon so they can't kill you.
Or best still, have them displace it first.
Yes.
Taking that bloke over there, and then you hit them.
Yeah, it's one thing that gets done. It's one thing that I know that everyone's trying to do. If I've got my spear just pointing at them, the people with long swords or axes or glaives are just 90% of their job is just keeping my weapon bound up and tangled up so I can't shiv everyone else.
Yeah, so you can't hurt anyone.
And that would work for swords as well. All you've got to do is like displace their sword and keep their sword bound up for a second. Your friend to the left of you, if you have a good sense of teamwork, can then take advantage for it before his friend stabs you because you're occupied. And that is really where practicing teamwork.
Hence the working through from individuals through pairs to 3.
build it up gradually. Don't throw them in. If you get thrown in the deep end, you're liable to drown.
Oh yeah, your brain will explode.
What the hell's going on? Yes, totally.
How we worked up to it means when the battle line, you go to Armadale, you're in a battle line of 200, it breaks up. However many you're with, you're cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because you've done this together with each other.
Yes.
Yes. And that comes from long experience.
It does. A team of 2 works one way, and a team of 3 works a different way.
Yeah. Yeah.
A team of 4 is not the same as 2 pairs.
No, it's not. No, and that's the other thing. Getting new people to go, guys. You can't have 2 pairs. You've got to work as 4. Otherwise, you're going to die. And you've got to know where everybody is.
Yes.
And if someone's not there, you have to subliminally be aware that someone who's on the other side isn't there, which means where are they?
Yes.
Hilariously, I'm finding it really interesting hearing these techniques, because the other element of historical fencing, massive air quotes here, is the mobile game Mordhau, which is basically, first-person shooter but with swords. And there are a lot of skills being done in clan work and more professional fighting that mirror all that stuff. One of the constant things we teach is how for 2 people to quickly surround and take care of 1 person. You'd be surprised how people who only know how to fight 1v1 have no idea how to work with a partner, even when they have a numerical advantage. And on the flip side, there's actually a skill we call it 1vxing, which is knowing how to fight 2 people and not get completely backstabbed by the other person, not get completely surrounded.
Although, of course, if you try and translate it to video games, you've got an extra layer of artificiality that goes in there.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is how the engine works. And as I know from personal experience, both with real life fighting and player versus player fighting on computer, I can't do PvP to save my life. None of the skills I have in real life can be translated across into a computer game.
No.
I find them entertaining, but other than that, I don't find them terribly useful as a teaching tool.
No, not as a teaching tool. I just found it more interesting how a lot of these concepts in reenactment.
You might see some of those. Yeah, you might see some of those general principles still being applied.
It's not so much that the video game teaches reenactment, but it's more reenactment is teaching the game. It's the other way around very much. I just found it interesting how people who aren't reenactors came up with those skills and said, this is how we're going to teach people to fight in groups. And it's like, oh, that's how I fight in reenactments. And they're very similar skills, and they've come from completely different backgrounds. And people who have no idea, who have never picked up a sword in their life.
Well, all roads eventually lead to Rome.
Hilariously,
going to meet up outside the forum. Go, where the hell did you come from?
Hilariously, the group is actually dedicated to replicating Roman tactics and formations. So, hilarious segue there. But I just did find that interesting how everything links up like that.
I mean, I imagine it also depends very heavily on the video game. Having had the experience Pete has with video games, but also playing Dark Souls, feeling like I can just countercut everything and then dying, as one does in Dark Souls. But oddly enough, in some games, and there's an increasing genre of sword sims with things like Mountain Blade and Mordhau, where some stuff does actually translate weirdly.
It does.
Like not everything, and it's obviously not going to. You're never going to have a one-to-one simulation.
You've got to have really good VR. If you've got really good VR, then you should be able to wave your arms around the way you do when there's a sword in it.
Oddly enough, no. People have been trying that, and as it turns out, proprioception is super important. It's actually VR technology would have to come a very long way before that's like one-to-one movement is viable. But yeah,
in the meantime, we're stuck with reenactment and HEMA.
Yeah. But weirdly enough, the one thing that I found actually that seems to translate better from historical sources to video games is formations. So like there's a big thing within the Mountain Blade multiplayer community to actually research and try and replicate formations, particularly in the Napoleonic Wars mod or DLC. So yeah, there's sort of I know it's kind of an interesting thing with reenactment where you've talked about how one-on-one reenactment combat doesn't seem to replicate historical combat at all. They don't use the same techniques. There's rules to stop you doing all sorts of useful historical things like sniping the forearms. But then when you get to the mass combat where it's about, situational awareness and maneuvering and flanking and things like that, it actually seems to translate a lot better.
You can make it work for you. And Michael Brown from ARF has made it work for him, where if he goes into one of those single combat tournaments with Sword and Shield at Armadale, he's invariably going to be the guy that wins. And he's working with the limited target rule set. I'm just not interested in fighting with those very limited target rule sets, most especially in one-on-one. In group combat, yeah, okay, that's all right. I'll throw javelins at people. But in a single fight, if I can't hit someone on the forearm, then yeah, okay, that's the prime target. What's the first thing you want to do to stop a fight? Take out the weapon arm. If you're able to, if they give it to you, if they're doing it properly, of course, they're not going to give it to you. No, you can use a saber, which has no hand protection whatsoever, and not get hit on the hand by using it properly. Well, that's got hand protection, but the stuff that Andy's guys do.
That's not a saber.
That's not
a saber.
I strongly beg to differ.
Yeah,
so
a wanker.
Now I'm a complete weakling, and I like a steel basket around my hand. Yes, being able to. So as I say, Michael Brown does very well. Here we go. Here's a proper saber, and he's got a proper saber.
It does allow us have a
that one.
It's a.
He's getting old, so he's compromised by having.
No. I've had that a lot, but I don't need that.
Right, because you've learned to do it without it.
Yep.
Yes.
Once upon a time, you see our fingers smashed all the time, and then we learned the difference. And a saber with no guard at all, a shashka.
Yes.
Perfectly fine, and a soft leather glove. Nothing more. Never get your fingers hurt. Just do it right.
Yes, just do it right. Yep.
One thing I will say that I'm quite frustrated, speaking of spears, the lack of spear and shield is something that does frustrate me. And I know that there's a lot of resistance to the idea of spear and shield in a lot of groups. I know that in my group that people are very wary to introduce spear and shield because even if the spear is quite short, they're worried. They're
afraid. They're afraid. In other words, they're afraid that it won't work in the limitations. The fact that people who do spear and shield don't hit people in the face is irrelevant. People's reasons for not wanting to do something have nothing to do with reason and everything to do with fear of change and then rationalizing it. But one of the things that I thought that Amas did very well was they had a strict progression of how you trained. The first weapon combination you had to train with was spear and shield. And you weren't allowed to touch another weapon until you'd considered to have mastered that. And spear and shield is hard. If you're allowed to pick up a long spear and use it two-handed, you learn how to use it quite quickly. And when someone says, well, you should take up a shield, you don't want to do it because spear and shield is hard. Teach someone the hard thing and then they can learn the easy thing. Once you've learned to use a two-handed spear, you're going to resist to the death with every possible argument you can think of as to why you should not go to spear and shield. But what it really is that you can do spear really easily. And as soon as you've got a shield in your hand, all of a sudden you're a beginner again. And no one who is experienced wants to be a beginner again.
I mean, that's would normally more efficient. It's definitely more efficient to like push it offside by conversation than learning.
Yes, it's basically what you come up with is a brick wall. And when you've got lots and lots of groups, that brick wall is much sturdier than if you're dealing with one integrated group where you can possibly get leverage and persuade them. If it's one group, they'll go, yeah, well, let's give this a go. But when it's lots and lots of little groups all doing their thing, off in their own little corner, occasionally coming together, you're never going to get, in my experience, like I say, after 10 years, I gave up. I thought, okay, I'm just not going to waste my time anymore. Maybe they'll change. Maybe someone else will gradually persuade them to change, but I'm not going to waste my energy. I got better things to do with it.
You've got to break the wall down 1,000 times. It's just too hard.
Yes. Yes.
Once is okay, but no.
I'd rather then work with people who actually do want to do, who actually are interested in what I'm trying to teach.
Well, then why don't you get a situation where you've got, like, if you've got a whole bunch of small groups, sure, getting all of them to change is very, very difficult. But why don't you get a situation where there's like a group here or a group here who just goes off in a different direction and goes, right, well, you know, we're gonna do a whole heap of spear and shield, and we're gonna, you know,
the way to do that, I think, is to run your own reenactment event. And I would rather pluck my own eyes out with sharpened fingernails than be involved in organizing a reenactment event. It would be the death of me. It really would. I've seen what it does to people, and I don't want to do it. So I know the sorts of things
groups
that
are
might.
bad enough.
Sorry?
Groups are bad enough.
Oh, yes.
Oh, God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Getting groups to agree to stuff. So no, if you're hosting an event, you can go, right, we're going to have these rules and you guys can run off and play with yours. But anyone who's interested in doing this new thing, come over here and we're going to do that. But you have to be the person who's the host. You have to step forward and be prepared to organize. And I'm no longer prepared to do that. I have enough organizing to do with other things. What it comes down to is that reenactors are like cats. And I don't want to herd them. Someone else wants to try and teach the cats to know how to be herded, then they're welcome to do it. And I will stand at the sidelines, cheering them on furiously. Yes, but I'm not going to bloody do it. The cats can herd themselves as far as I'm concerned.
Speaking of real life combat and reenactment in HEMA, there is actually one thing that ties these things together, that it was an aspect of combat. It's not just the hit that you're doing that intends to go, but the one hit that I know we're worried about with spear is not that the people facing each other 1v1 are going to hit, but that a hit is going to bounce off something else and careening off randomly into someone else's face,
and hit someone's face,
which is something that can happen historically. So that if you hit and it misses, you can just kind of redirect, and a technique can redirect if you kind of don't get it right. If you don't get it exactly right, there's a plan B in historical fencing or actual historical combat, both in groups and 1v1. The accidental hit can still be a lethal hit, whereas in reenactment, the accidental hit is the one which results in someone's teeth being someone eating a spear accidentally.
Which is unique, I think, to Dark Age combat, because of course anyone doing, for example, 15th century stuff is armored from head to toe, so they're not going to be injured in that way. Injuries are going to occur differently, probably more like falling over and then 6 people falling on top of you. But it is unique to Dark Age, to the sort of early period where the armor is much lighter. But that's worrying about that being a consequence of changing the way you do things is actually not the reason why you don't want to change things, because how do you prevent any weapon from being accidentally redirected? The answer is you spend a lot of time practicing with each other, learning to pull back blows that are going in an unsafe direction. And once you can do that, it doesn't matter what is in your hand, whether it's a sword or a one-hand spear or a two-hand spear. You just need to learn that skill. I mean, it astonishes me that hundreds of reenactors get together in Australia and have done so for years and years and years and years. And now that I've been doing HEMA all these years, seeing someone with an unprotected throat horrifies me. Not wearing, people bare from here up to here, and yet they're not being hurt.
And this feeds into the way we train. Doing what reenactors do with the protection they have, particularly in early medieval or ancient, is really fucking dangerous.
Yes.
So they train really hard to be in control of their weapons. Now, yes, accidents still happen, but we've never had a death in Australia. We've never had a couple of serious injuries. It's really, compared to the number of hours people have been doing it, it's very rare because people, by and large, are in control of what they're doing. Now, in HEMA and in the SCA, a different approach tends to be taken. It's too hard to be in that much control. So armour up, wear masks, wear big gloves, wear protection, and it doesn't matter if you're a bit slack, you won't get it anyway. Perhaps because of our reenactment background, as I mean me and Quaff and the imagery effect we work with, we don't go along with that. We emphasise very much be in control of your weapon at all times. In a fight with lots of people, you're right, well, things will slip, and you better be prepared to stop that like that. In a one-to-one, it's not, you only got that one bloke to worry about. It's not going to slip off his neighbour. It'll still happen though. Accidents will happen. And you can armour up to guard against them, and or you can learn weapon control to guard against them.
Absolutely.
So that is perhaps another thing that HEMA in general could learn from reenactors. Being in control of your bloody weapon.
Being more in control, yes.
It's a lethal weapon.
Yes.
And if you're not in control of it, you're irresponsible. Do not rely on masks and gloves and armour to protect your training partner. Be in control of your weapon.
You still need to control it, because the mask isn't there to stop a heavy-handed hit. The mask is there so that you can use the face as a target, not so you can put someone's eye out. Yes. And it is easier when you are wearing more protective gear to go a bit harder on each other. And in one-on-one, the same thing. You can go harder. As soon as you start mixing it up and you've got numbers of people, you have to learn a different skill, which is pulling back on what you're doing, which gets you further and further away from an actual battle. But that's okay, because we're never going to be in an actual battle. We are playing with each other.
You find that the use of more and more armour, then people rely on the armour for protection.
The more armor you put on, the more you are going to rely on it. That is always going to happen. You want people to fight really, really carefully. Get them to fight naked.
Yeah.
And they will fight, and they will fight much more carefully. But I mean, again, it depends on the period that you're doing. You know, if you're doing full armored period. But even then, if you have historically accurate armor, you're going to find it's not going to protect you in many cases from really heavy-handed hits. So then you have to make your armor thicker to make up for it, or add extra padding to it, until eventually, of course, you end up with something like tournament armor, you hardly move.
Then you're no longer doing historical combat.
Yes. No, well, that's the thing, as you were saying, that there's this gap between what we're doing and some form of perceived reality.
The idea of historical combat is or reenactment, is to reenact the battle of the time.
To attempt to do so, yes, which is something that's always interested me. How would they have fought? How would they have done it? And I'd like to know how they did it, and then try within the limitations of safety and gear to reproduce that. So we can't. The thing you can't reproduce in arena battle or in the HEMA stuff is the sheer adrenaline of wanting to just absolutely enrage and kill someone. We can't do that one, but we can.
Or even to kill them coolly.
Yeah. So a video I actually made a little while back about my experiences with my mental health and doing HEMA at the time. I found that when I was doing a lot of like early epee, so when it was being used for duels, when my anxiety was really bad, I started doing all the things that the people who describe early epee say will happen in a duel that doesn't happen in the cell. And so like there was like overcarrying parries, greater vigor in action. So it's not, I don't think it's entirely unknowable, the effects of adrenaline, because like adrenaline doesn't just come from the situation you're in. Adrenaline can also come because you're having a very bad time and all of a sudden you're feeling very anxious and all of a sudden all your movements are now gigantic and fine motor skills go out the window. So yeah, I think there is a bit, like there are sort of little places we can kind of get those insights into the effect of adrenaline, even if it's not like just from not the literal adrenaline you get from a literal battle.
Adrenaline is easy to come by. What's not is the expectation of imminent death.
Yes. Yeah, you can get frightened. You can get nervous because you're getting into a fight with someone you know is better than you, and he or she is going to hit you, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it, and that creates anxiety. But yes, the thing the difference is the sharp blade.
Yes.
As soon as there's a sharp blade,
the sharp blade in the hands of a man who intends to kill you.
Yes.
That combination is not something we get.
Yep.
Readily.
Or the whole Special Forces training syllabus is based around the use of, as close as can be, live ammunition and live blades.
You mentioned that earlier, Meg, and that ties in nicely to my earlier comment about natural versus art of defence. They don't go for art. In that situation, you're going to be natural. In the face of the fear of death, without decades of art as a result of being part of a professional warrior caste, you're not going to have all that technique to rely on. So rather than using art to overcome nature, what all these special force techniques, whether it's sustainment or Krav Maga or whatever it may be, is harness nature.
Yes, make an art of nature.
What you would naturally do, oh, fuck. Okay, do that, but do it just right.
Yep.
Which is a very different approach from all the arts that we're learning.
I think the
Special
Forces
is one
from
thing,
combat.
art of defence is another.
I think from combat, from my experience in Eastern martial arts, is that at some point it's good to push people to where they feel they're in real combat, whatever level they're at, whether that be elite level or whether that be the average empty off the street, is that to push them to the point beyond which they are comfortable and within their comfort zone. And that's all you can really do is to try and do it. You can't threaten to kill people. I mean, it's short on the roof.
And which aspect of reality you're trying to push them toward? A combative reality, a dual reality, a 15th century military reality? They're different.
Oh,
different.
Yeah.
So I agree. Yes, sure. It's useful to push people to the edge of their envelope and
in whatever development you're doing, in whatever part you're doing.
But which envelope we're talking about?
I think whatever part you're reenacting or HEMA group, I think it's the best way of doing it.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Excuse my stuff in my face.
Tim, can you see Kirok's comment? I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm just going to make a reply.
Make a reply out loud, and just for the people at home, for anyone who's watching this afterwards and is wondering what the comment is, Kirok suggested, as a broad generalization, it sounds like LARP has safe weapons, unsafe armor, mediocre weapon control. HEMA has unsafe weapons, safe armor, poor weapon control. LARP and he's got LARP, unsafe weapons, safe armor, safe
weapons control, and bugger that last should be reenacted. But kind of
as that fingers.
Yeah.
That's a broad generalization, not entirely untrue. HEMA weapons are we put tips on the ends of our pointy weapons. If
I would say categorically,
that sort of
HEMA weapons are safer than reenactment weapons, in that there are reenactment weapons or weapons that are suitable for reenactment events that are not permitted at the Old Sword Club because the tips are either too fine, they're too stiff, or they're too heavy.
Yes.
And HEMA weapons are also typically modeled after historical training weapons, which are designed to be safe, whereas reenactment weapons are kind of more of a compromise
around historical models.
More of a compromise to look like historical models. But,
yes.
I don't.
And some of those can be safe, but some of them are much harder to be safe. Axes, for example, if I was in charge of reenactment combat, no one will be allowed to have a historically weighted axe. Everyone would have to have really, really light two-handed axes so that they could make proper movements with them. I'd rather see a thin sheet metal axe that weighed next to nothing, that you could bring back from over your shoulder and swing down properly at someone and not split their skull open, rather than one that was closer to historical weight. Although I suspect that a lot of the axes used by reenactors, the two-handed axes, are in fact heavier than they were historically. An axe, like a sword, doesn't have to be heavy to do damage.
Yeah, well, it's one thing I've noticed now, as Pete was saying, there's a lot of reenactment suppliers who have allowed for a lot of HEMA practitioners to have good access to weapons. And you go through and a lot of them now have specific categories for HEMA, reenactment, and buhurt. And all the HEMA weapons are always lighter and have either rolled or spatulated tips, like the tips are wide enough, modeled after historical training weapons. The reenactment ones tend to be heavier, and in some cases a little bit heavier than even the historical weapons, because what someone's done is they've taken a historical sharp and then they've just gone from a fine sharp tip and given it like a 2-3 mil edge. And then you have the buhurt ones, which are similar sort of thing where they're heavier, but they also have a much higher point of balance because the goal is to knock someone over with the weapon. So yeah, sort of, I don't know, I find that HEMA weapons on the whole tend to be lighter, and I would suggest a bit safer than a lot of reenactment weapons, just by virtue of the fact that they can't
veering towards sport weapons.
Yeah, well,
they are veering more and more towards sport weapons.
Yeah, well, they are more in fetters, like the two-handed swords that people use for training HEMA are modelled after the two-handed swords that were used to train people in the period.
Yes.
Most of the 19th century sabers that you can find now are reproductions of 19th century training sabers. So yeah, it's a bit.
And are they lighter than the ones used in actual battles?
Depends. With actual killie sabers, there's a huge variance in weight. But with gymnasium sabers, there's also there's a fair variance in weight. Like you do military so you get military sabers that are as light as battlefield sabers are as light as 600 grams, and then you get some that are almost a kilo. And then with the training sabers, you get some that are about as light as 600 grams, and then probably the same variance, but the averages are different.
Right.
Funnily enough, I've actually noticed that tendency of really small axes is a thing, particularly in Western European combat, where it's I've noted from people who are, say, in the UK and Germany, and to a lesser extent France, and to a lesser extent Scandinavia, particularly in the British reenactment circle, axes and spearheads tend to actually be really small. The reason I know this is that a lot of the people who are historical purists from a living history perspective tend to have a laugh at them every time they get caught with the damn things. And yeah, really lightened axes are very much a thing. And I know at least one person, Mitch of the Iron Guard up in the Blue Mountains, made me a small one-handed axe that was the head was 130 grams. It's light as the whole thing weighs like less than 300, and with a 70 centimeter haft, with the very specific instruction, and he does this with every other weapon he makes, with the very specific idea that the thing is very heavily underweight, so he can strike with the appropriate level of speed and intensity. So I found that, and that's definitely an idea. Like you see very hollowed out those big framework like the Gotland axe, which has the small cross on the inside and it's a lot of empty air. There are versions of those that are very, very light that are being sold, and spearheads also tend to be really small. People who use one-handed spear, particularly in Britain, the spearheads are tiny. They're people joke about them; they call them spoons.
Well, look, I've got basically a javelin. What would most likely have been a javelin head on my favorite one-handed spear. The opposite is a thing that's basically a battering ram that's used to smash shields to pieces or to knock them aside, which is a horrible use of a spear. It's not how you use them, or at least it's not how I perceive people would have used them, because getting your spear stuck in someone's shield is not very helpful to you.
I do know that standard when it comes to, say, Burma Interclub and other such things. Generally speaking, when it comes to stabbing at other people's shields, it's very much come into the rules in general and just general safety briefings and stuff to not just batter down other people's shields and not to use as a battering ram. as courtesy for people's gear, and also in the understanding that if the shield will suddenly move and you have that battering ram swim, it's suddenly going to battering ram swing a fleshy person underneath, is very much how it's explained in all the safety briefings at Berrimer and other such things.
So adrenaline takes over and frustration, and I've got to knock this shield aside. So, yeah.
I tend to just lever them, to be perfectly honest. I tend to just like wiggle them aside, and I tend to use my spear less like a battering ram, more like a pry bar, or with a sharp knock if it's a round shield to just tilt it on the axis, like what you do. You knock the shield to another thing, and quickly switch around and try to attack
to get around it. Yes.
Line. Yeah, using it as a pry bar, I find, and then there's the use of wings, which is that's just a whole different ball game, whether it's two-handed or one-handed. Once wings or power or any
axis do the same thing. But yes, LARP is. But having watched, as I said before, having watched LARP combat, and there's enormous similarities between that and HEMA combat. The main difference being, of course, that they're done with foam swords. Don't underestimate the ability of a foam sword to inflict pain on someone else.
I can attest to this.
Those foam swords can really hurt if someone swings them at you. They really can. You sort of go, wow, okay. Yeah, look, guys, flail away at each other with these foam swords by all means, but just look out for the fact that they do in fact hurt.
The hammers in particular hurt. Like, I've been hit with like a 5-foot tall maul, and one thing I find that hurts them most is often ears, like head, when we're striking like this, particularly if the foam katanas, because almost everyone in my group and several other groups tend to have LARP swords, and at the larger events, once the lights go out and everyone is in the encampment, the LARP swords tend to come out, and it just tends to turn into this impromptu fight ring just outside
in
of
the dark.
Encampment.
Yes,
in the dark.
Yes, the perfect situation for a storm of injuries.
Yeah, I tend to get whacked. I tend to end up with very sore ears, and yeah, those things hurt. One thing that I will say as well of LARP, and when I first visited Melbourne Saltcraft back in 2013, there were two things about it that really caught my eye. One was numbers, because Melbourne Saltcraft is ginormous, because unlike Sydney re-enactment, where every group goes and trains in their own little park every Saturday, it was Melbourne Saltcraft, every single little mini group trains in one group, and so every single week, it's like 100 people per side. The other thing that I found really interesting and enlightening, which was the fact that there are so many missiles flying about. I know for a fact that I went fairly recently, and I just had a breastplate, a helmet, and I had some HP, quote unquote. But all two people needed to do was lean into a gap, point a pistol at my breastplate, fire, and suddenly I was at the point where I needed medical assistance.
Missiles, yes. I mean, if they've got, that's something LARP can bring to reenactment. Missiles.
Yeah, and I know that.
See it if everybody had javelins in reenactment combat, you'd see a marked diminution in the number of two-handed spearmen.
I know for a fact that when it comes to Byzantine, and this also translates to later medieval stuff, the reason the two-handed polearms are much more prevalent has probably less to do with slung shields and much more to do with the fact that the standard level of armor is much higher than in the Byzantine Empire, as opposed to Anglo-Saxon England, Scandinavia, the Rus kingdoms, etc. Your bog standard soldier, at the very least, has the equivalent of the 15th century layered jack, roughly speaking, ish. And I would say that probably allows these foot soldiers to wield these two-handed spears and not be as worried about being pin-cushioned, even though the shield still matters. And we know that
professionals with first-hand issue equipment, perhaps more importantly.
And we see it once we hit the 14th century, the 13th and 14th century, there's a much larger number of people with various sorts of two-handed cut and thrust polearms.
Yes, you need good. If you want to use and that's the other thing. Once armor becomes good enough to protect you, so you don't have to worry about missiles and protect you from one-handed weapons, there's no point taking a spear to combat. It's not good enough anymore. You take something nastier. A hammer, a halberd.
Bill,
Yeah,
Bill.
poleaxe. You take something, you take a can opener with you, a head smasher, a limb mangler, a spear no longer cuts, which is why the longsword was only used militarily for a relatively short period of time. As soon as people moved to full plate, you had a longsword as a backup weapon, but if you went into combat with a longsword and you're facing someone with a halberd, you're stuffed.
That means
Yeah, you want. And the armor will protect you excellently against missiles until muskets came in. Then all of a sudden, armor became useless. Well, not useless. Armor became much less useful.
I will say that I think the point is less that the armor is good, but it's more the percent that there is a much once we hit the high and later medieval period, the number of people who have armor which is good enough is much higher. It's more that there've always been people with armor that's good enough. Mail's always been good enough, but it's more that that armor tended to be concentrated into relatively small numbers who could use two-handed axes and other big things and not worried about being down by the first thing that's hoiked at them.
Europe got wealthier. Over several hundred years, Europe got richer and richer and richer, and as a result, more and more people could afford protection.
More stuff.
Yes.
We know from various assizes of arms from 1181 and the 1200s in England and Italy that, curiously, I think the one in 1280 or 1291 actually specifies that the foot soldier has a cap, an iron cap, or a helm, a jack, or a gambeson, whatever it actually says, and a lance. No mention of a shield, interestingly enough. Like, I found that surprising as well, and I figured, wait a second, where's the shield? Isn't everyone supposed to have spear and shield? Why only a spear?
In Anglo-Saxon England, shields were most definitely mandated.
Oh,
the law
definitely.
was quite specific about how they were to be made.
Yeah.
But look, guys, it's starting to get late.
It is.
It is now
20 past 10.
20 past 10.
I was waiting for a point to wrap things up. So this is quite fortuitous.
That's fair.
To wind up. This is a subject that can go on forever.
Absolutely.
But not this notch.
It's not tonight.
It was great.
Not tonight.
Right, cool. So we might officially end it there. So this is the point where I'm going to stop the recording. Traditionally, what we do is still hang around and chat. So if anyone wants to stay around and keep talking about the different, really anything at this point, you're more than welcome to. But I'm going to end the recording, but not before saying thank you very much, Pete, for coming on and talking. It was really, really interesting.
You're welcome. Yes, thanks for coming along and listening to me pontificating about one of my favorite subjects.
Yep. So we're going to have another event on same time next week online using the same link. The event for that will be up by tomorrow. I'm just still working out what it is, unfortunately. But hopefully we'll see you again next week, or at some point in the future. And hopefully we'll be able to probably catch up once COVID's over and we can actually see each other in person.
Okie doke.
So,
All right, folks. Well, nice chatting.